inventions, power, black out the past. Forget the quiet cities. Bring in the steam and steel, the iron men, the giants. Open the throttle, all aboard, the promised land. Pillars of smoke by day, pillars of fire by night, pillars of progress. Machines to make machines, production to expand production. Enough for tens, thousands, millions, millions, faster and faster, better and better.
At the beginning of the 20th century, factories and chimneys sprang up as never before. The burning of coal and oil increased wealth in an inferno of smoke, steam and soot. And for people living in the constantly expanding industrial cities, smoke from chimneys became a natural part of daily life.
People sometimes would come to the town if they weren't familiar with it, and they'd say, "What's that smell?" Well, if you lived there, you'd say, "Well, it smells just fine to me." Sometimes my grandfather would say, "Well, that's the smell of money," because we just took it for granted that if you wanted to have a job, if you wanted the town to be working, that this was the price that you paid.
Most people living in the Ruhr District had moved there because they found a job, because they could earn money, and for them it was fantastic. It was the alternative to going to America. And at that time, many people called it the German Wild West because it offered all the opportunities America offered. So for them, every factory they saw was a sign of progress, a sign of making money, making a living.
Many companies had on the letterhead of their notepaper pictures of their own factories, and those factories always had huge clouds of smoke coming out of the chimneys as a symbol of the productivity of that company. You know, smoke equaled progress. There's a saying in the Midlands, where there's muck, there's money.
The Ruhr District in Germany is the biggest industrial area in Europe. The presence of coal in the area was very attractive for the industry, and hundreds of huge factories shot up. Though not everybody was enthusiastic about the smoking chimneys.
Some regions were more or less like a preserve for industry. That is, nature wasn't protected. As the court ruling said, you can't expect nature to survive. And there was a case of someone who owned fruit trees, and the fruit trees were very close to a factory. And he said, all the trees were damaged, so I want compensation. And the ruling said, okay, we accept that the fruit trees don't grow any fruits no more, so there was a damage. But you can't expect to get compensation because you live in an industrial area. You have to accept that there's all this pollution and damage going on.
At the beginning of the 20th century, smoke was so thick in London, then the largest city in the world, that the authorities tried to pass laws against its emission from the many chimneys dotted around the city, but without success.
At the end of the 1800s, people were very aware that the smoke was a problem, so they wanted to eliminate smoke. But they still needed to allow some smoke, of course, for people to heat their houses. So they tried to eliminate smoke which was black. But of course, you know, industry would argue, well, my smoke is not black, my smoke is brown, so it's not covered by the legislation. So this loophole just, you know, so weakened the law that ultimately it was quite inapplicable.
Production in the industrial centres ran day and night, year in, year out, almost without interruption. One of the few times where smoke actually ever did disappear from the sky was in the Ruhr District back in 1923. French troops had invaded the industrial area because the German government had refused to pay compensation to France after World War I, and in protest, German workers went on strike.
Since it was a general strike, all industrial production stopped almost overnight. And for all of spring and all of summer, there was no industrial production. So all of a sudden, the air was clean. And funnily enough, the trees and everything started to grow again. And there are reports from people living there that say, okay, look at this, it's fantastic. Trees grow much bigger. Fruits, we have more fruit, and at the same time, we can eat it. But the lesson in the end was, if the only way to get clean air is to shut down industry, then that's not a way to do it, because then people don't have work. And as a consequence, people were quite relieved when the general strike stopped and they could start producing again and get some income.
In the 1930s, people realized that smoke from chimneys is not just a sign of wealth and prosperity. For the thousands of tons of soot spreading out over all major cities was a huge economical burden to society. In England alone, 200,000 people were employed in laundries, and considerable amounts of money were spent on polishing windows of offices and public buildings. At the same time, people were growing more and more concerned about the health of their children, living literally in the shadow of the urban smoke.
Few children get all the vitamin D that they need in their food, but they can make all that is necessary if enough sunlight falls on their skins. If they don't get enough sunlight or enough vitamin, they will develop rickets and bad teeth. Now these children here are getting artificial ultraviolet radiation in order to protect them from rickets. It may be as good as real sunlight, but it's a great deal more expensive.
There were fogs that were acidic, hard to breathe, illnesses that were bronchitic in nature, and doctors just recognized this. I suppose you could ask the question then, well, why did they let it continue? If the doctors recognized this, why did they allow this to go on? Well, I suppose you could think of two possible reasons. One was simply political. The political will to change that, to change industry, to shift to some other fuel would be very, very difficult. But also the mechanisms. Coal was the fuel which drove cities. How were they going to change it?
Critical voices began attacking the consequences of industrial progress. Here's a sequence from an American documentary of 1939, which describes, among other things, life in the small industrial town of Donora in the state of Pennsylvania.
Smoke makes prosperity, they tell you here. Smoke makes prosperity, no matter if you choke on it. We got to face life in these shacks and alleys. We got to let our children take their chances here with rickets, typhoid, TB, or worse. They draw a blank, the kids. They have no business here, this no man's land. This slag heap wasn't meant for them. There's poison in the air we breathe. There's poison in the river. The fog and smoke below ride up and choke us.
Well, it was a normal thing for us. We accepted it as being something to live in and around and have it around us all the time. The environment was really something that was normal for us because we grew up in it.
We didn't see much sunshine here in Donora because of the way, there was so much smoke from the steel mill and from the zinc works. So this was going on all the time. I don't think we understood that there was sun and vegetation and beautiful surroundings that there were in many other parts of Of course, back in those days, a big day for us would be a trip to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was highly polluted at that time also.
It was not until serious accidents began to occur that people started realizing that smoke was more than just a hazard to their health. Smoke can also kill, as in the case of Donora in 1948.
For a period of about 5 days in October in 1948, the fumes from the mills continued to come up, and they couldn't go away. They couldn't dissipate. And after 5 days, people began to get sick in their homes, in the mill, on the streets. And they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how wrong it was.
On Friday morning, we were walking to school. We could barely see the street lights, and they were on, and we could hardly see the traffic signals along McCain Avenue. And we really didn't understand that there was a tragedy unfolding within our community.
You couldn't hardly see your hand in front of your face if you put it up like that. And it was like night at 12 o'clock noon on Main Street in Donora.
Yes.
It was like midnight.
I went to bed one night and everything was fine. I woke up the next morning and every one of my plants were as dead as they could be. African violets, cactus. I forget what the other ones were, but they were all dead and they never came back to life.
People start calling the fire station. They couldn't breathe.
That's right.
So we had to carry oxygen to them to get them some oxygen so they could breathe.
What happened in the town was that people started to die. So many of them died in such a short period of time that the local funeral homes ran out of caskets. The place I went to go to the Girl Scouts became a temporary morgue.
In the 5 days Donora was covered in smoke from local chimneys, 20 out of 12,000 inhabitants died, and a greater number grew sick.
We know that almost half the town was affected, a little more than 40%, during the smog, had some kind of symptom. But what was more apparent afterwards was that a steady amount of pollution over a long period of time would also worsen and sicken the lives of many. My own grandmother had a heart attack during this smog, but she didn't die. So she's not one of those statistics celebrated in Donora. My grandmother didn't die until her 25th heart attack, 7 years later.
People in Europe were also experiencing serious pollution from smoke after World War II, and one of the largest cities most affected was London.
Fog, the longest and thickest on record, brings Britain its darkest days since the blackout. Blanketing all parts of the country, it gives transport services an even bigger headache than bank holiday. Trains run hours behind time. In 144 hours of non-stop fog, 5 trains are in collision. Detonators laid on the rails signal the approach of oncoming trains. Despite everything, they still go through.
People were used to fogs, but the one of 52 was extraordinarily thick. It said that many people simply couldn't get home. You know, children on their way home from school were unable to get home, and they had to stay with friends because they simply couldn't find their way down the street. I mean, people began to run out of food. The buses obviously stopped completely, and football matches had to be cancelled. I mean, it can show you how terrible these fogs were.
The London smog in the winter of 1952 developed into a catastrophe. During one single week alone, 4,000 inhabitants died in London. But the authorities denied that the countless small chimneys were the cause of it all, placing the blame on a flu epidemic instead.
The government actually very cynically, Harold Macmillan, who was then the housing minister, who would go on to become the prime minister, said, ridiculous as it seems, we've got to look like we're doing something. Let's form a committee. I know we can't do much, but we can look like we're rather busy. And that very cynical expression in the cabinet of the British government carried the day. So they appointed a committee, and they even agreed to hand out thousands of perfectly useless cloth masks, knowing that they would do no good whatsoever against smog when it hit again.
The London smog created an outcry. The inhabitants of London were gravely concerned that the catastrophe would repeat itself, and at public meetings, people demanded action be taken.
Smoke has crept insidiously into our lives and bred a kind of apathy. The time has come when it must creep into our conscience. There let it breed not apathy, but action.
3 years later, the British Parliament passed a law that, among other things, limited the burning of coal for heating private homes. House owners were now encouraged to change from coal-burning fireplaces to gas or oil boilers.
It seemed to me that the significance of the 1956 Act wasn't really that it fundamentally cured air pollution. Much more significant for the 56 Act was that it essentially stopped people's freedom. You were no longer free to burn what you liked in your house.
Donora in London marked a turning point. It was no longer possible to deny that air pollution could kill people. These episodes made it clear that you had to clean up the air if you were going to try to protect health.
We're the team at J-Car, right here in Nelson, 120 Hardy Street. Our shop is full of electronic items,
including security alarm systems, electronic components,
solar and power,
electronics toys,
sound systems, cables, and much, much more.
J-Car. 120 Hardy Street, Nelson.
World War I was a defining period in our history, impacting greatly on the lives of people from the Nelson province. Memories of the First World War is an exhibition which will be displayed in a number of regional venues and is currently on at the Nelson Provincial Museum.
Are you looking for a scooter, walker, wheelchair, baby seats or pushchairs? Then come in and see the Nelson Region Specialist at Mobility for You, 269 Queen Street, Richmond, opposite the library. We have a huge selection of scooters, walkers, wheelchairs and accessories, along with a free booklet guide. We also provide a breakdown service if you ever get a puncture or a flat battery. We have fully equipped service vans to rescue you. Hi, I'm Robin Jordan and I invite you to call in and see the friendly team at Mobility for You, 269 Queen Street, Richmond, opposite the library.
Nelson Tire Center, great prices, great service. Buy your own Bryford trailer, all types, all sizes.
Hi, I'm Colin from Nelson Tire Centre. Come on down for a good deal.
During the 1950s and the following decades, factories were moved from the cities to specially built industrial areas, where the chimneys grew taller and taller. Pollution from factories was reduced, though not significantly, but diluted in that it was spread over a larger area. At the same time, both housing and power stations in the big cities converted to burning oil and gas rather than coal, and consequently air in the big cities was no longer as affected by thick chimney smoke. But a new type of pollution, however, had in the meanwhile become just as much a threat to the air in big cities around the world.
In the post-war boom in economy, people suddenly find they have the ability to buy motor vehicles for the first time. So that explosion of motor vehicles means that there's a transfer of pollution sources from the stationary source, the home or industry, to the automobile as the prime sort of urban source of pollution.
In Europe, the ratio of one family, one car was doubled in the USA, and the emission of gases from cars covered the streets of big cities in a new type of photochemical smog, which posed a threat to public health. In 1970, Tokyo, one of the world's largest cities, was about to choke. In only 10 years, the number of vehicles had doubled 4 times over, and more than 500,000 people were affected by air pollution. More than half of them children under the age of 9. At this school in Yokkaichi, the school has quit the morning assembly. Instead, the morning starts with breathing exercises, gargling of the mouth, and rubbing of the skin in order to strengthen the children's resistance against pollution. And the school has installed an air cleaner so that the children can breathe clean air at least for a couple of hours. The end-of-term celebration of the school turns into a demonstration, with children and teachers refusing to sing the traditional song of tribute to the city because the mother of one of the pupils has just died due to the pollution of the city. In most of the industrialized world, the inhabitants of big cities started to protest against air pollution, and in 1970, hundreds of thousands of people marked the beginning of what has now become an annual anti-pollution demonstration, Earth Day.
Earth Day was like a global rock concert where millions of people all over the world came together and said, we want to recognize the need for a cleaner environment. And the inspiration for it came in part from some of the astronauts who looked at the lonely planet and saw that you could take your thumb when you were up out in space, and with your thumb you could blot out the entire world from which we came. And that metaphor was such a powerful one that it spread very rapidly to make clear that we had only one planet, and it was that first public consciousness of the global nature of the environment that was incorporated into the media and became a very powerful image and drove a lot of activities, including a lot of legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, ultimately efforts to control toxic substances and hazardous waste, all came from this understanding of the single planet that we inhabit and how you really can't expect pollution to follow state or national boundaries.
During the 1970s, it became clear it was not only cities which were under attack from pollution from industry and constantly growing traffic. For poisonous gases don't respect city and country boundaries, but rather return as acid rain to a hitherto untouched nature. Words such as acid rain and death of the forest began to draw public attention.
In the 80s in Germany, if you look at acid rain, everybody, or very many people were afraid. There was this huge fear. For instance, it was claimed that by about 2000 there would be no trees whatsoever left in all of Germany, which of course at that time people, it scared them death almost. No? All of a sudden it became clear to them, we have to do something about air pollution. There was a willingness more than ever to spend money for the government to pass laws, and it made an enormous difference. Industry had to change, had to install all these filters and new techniques. And secondly, all the laws, the new laws were passed to make sure that cars are not as polluting as they were. That is, the catalysts were introduced in Germany and then in the rest of Europe too. It was a European process.
The impact on the forests of Europe was, however, not as drastic as first feared, and catalytic converters and increased emission standards for industry and traffic in the major cities improved air quality. During the next 20 years, the quantity of sulfur dropped to 1/10, and the so-called nitrogen oxides from the emissions of cars were also reduced, even though the increasing number of vehicles was an extra added factor. For the air in many large cities contained hazardous amounts of carbon monoxide, soot and particles. And despite the improvements, a city like Los Angeles was still heavily polluted by smog at the beginning of the 1990s.
They go to the nurseries and play, but the playtime is restricted. Children with asthma or elderly citizens are required to stay in the home because the air quality is so bad.
When did you wash this car?
I washed this car yesterday morning, and as the winds came in, as you can see here, smog is back already.
We know from studies that have been done that a little bit of particulate air pollution, smaller than a human hair, if you're exposed to it throughout your lifetime, has an effect. It increases your chance of dying, of heart disease, of lung cancer, of a stroke, of a whole bunch of other problems, and also increases the chance that you'll have serious lung disease throughout your entire life.
An investigation undertaken by the World Health Organization estimated that around 800,000 people were dying of air pollution every year, most of them in the explosively growing megacities of the developing world.
Today, we've got 24 cities with populations over 10 million. And 3 out of every 4 of the world's largest cities are in the developing world. And in these mega cities, you've got millions of children who don't have their basic needs being met. And on top of that, you have growing amounts of buses and diesel trucks and small, sputtering, polluting little cars and carts and taxis and industry.
Megacities in poor parts of the world grow so fast that authorities have a hard time keeping up. In Calcutta, India, pollution from local chimneys and vehicles are a burden to the lungs of inhabitants comparable with smoking 20 cigarettes a day. And in one of the most polluted cities in the world, Mexico City, the air is often thick with smog. From time to time, schools in the city are closed, and during one particularly hazardous smog episode, inhabitants saw birds drop down dead from the sky and fall into many of the city's large squares.
It's clear that the population density and the lack of basic development is such that if we only provide for growth in these countries, we're basically condemning generations of these children to impaired lives. There is no question that we need to invest much more in energy efficiency and renewable resources and not wait 20 years for the hydrogen economy to see whether or not it happens.
In the South African city of Durban, almost 300,000 people live in the industrial centre of the big city, right next door to huge refineries and numerous factories which churn out tons of sulphur and other hazardous substances all over the city from chimneys, much to the annoyance and detriment of local residents.
It smells ugly. It smells like an old rotten egg, and I don't think anybody likes to smell it. It smells horrible.
Yeah, sometimes when the smell is very bad, your chest gets more heavier and you start to cough a lot. Sometimes some children faint.
Can you see the pollution when it comes, or can you just smell it?
We smell it.
We had a number of instances where children have had mass respiratory problems because of the pollution, where children were hospitalized and had to seek medical attention. The school had to be closed down on a number of occasions.
The medical faculty in Durban has made tests on 300 students from one of the local schools. The investigation showed that the students hold a very disturbing world record.
When we were conducting the study, we found that a lot of children would be absent from on a regular basis because of their asthmatic condition. Approximately 50% of the pupils studied reported respiratory symptoms in keeping with a condition like asthma. Well, based on the international studies that we reviewed, based on the current available literature, this school had the highest recorded levels of children with symptoms of asthma. It has a major impact on the life of a child. Missing school, poor attendance at classes, therefore repeated failures in school, and in the long term it means that this child is not going to be a very significant breadwinner, not going to find a good enough job. So in a sense, the pollution then traps this child in a vicious cycle of poverty.
When industrialization seriously speeded up at the beginning of the 20th century, smoking chimneys were then the symbol of progress and wealth. Today, however, we're more than aware of the price to be paid for our progress, especially in the developing countries.
Nelson Tire Center. Great prices, great service. Buy your own Bryford trailer. All types, all sizes.
Hi, I'm Colin from Nelson Tire Centre. Come on down for a good deal.